Well, Prime Minister Tony Abbott is back in Australia after a highly successful trip to Indonesia. To discuss that issue and more, we're joined by one of our regulars, Liberal MP and Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg. Josh, the government must be very happy with the results from the Jakarta meeting.
Well, good morning. Nice to be with you, Chris. I think it was a very successful visit. The tone, the body language, and obviously the announcement that Indonesia and Australia will be working bilaterally together on the border protection issue is a very important outcome for the country, and a reflection on Tony Abbott's diplomatic skills, which I must say the Labor Party wrote him off before the election, saying no Asian leader would deal with him and that he wouldn't be a statesman in the role. Well, he's actually confronted his critics very early on, and I think this has been a very successful visit.
Now, the Indonesians made some significant compromises, including agreeing to bilateral negotiations and consultations over the asylum seeker issue. What were the compromises that Tony Abbott was forced to make?
Look, I don't think it's about compromises. I think it's about saying that we want to work with you. We've got a suite of measures that we announced before the election that we will continue to implement now that we're in government. But we also understand that a lot of these vessels are Indonesian flagged, Indonesian crewed, departing from Indonesian ports, and we need the close cooperation of our good friend and neighbour Indonesia. And so that's why this meeting was so important, and it was the Prime Minister's first visit overseas, Chris, consistent with his line of more Jakarta, less Geneva. And I think it's a reflection that the two countries can work very effectively together because it's in our mutual interests to deal effectively with the border protection issue.
So you're saying the Indonesians have backed down, they've made some compromises, but Australia hasn't?
I'm not saying any side's made compromises. I'm saying when you get a face-to-face meeting, as opposed to comments through the media, it can be much more constructive, and I think that's what you found when the two leaders have been face-to-face, and Tony Abbott now no longer the opposition leader, now the Prime Minister. And Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, the President of Indonesia and a very dear friend of Australia. I think the two of them coming together to talk through the issues where, as Tony Abbott said, Chris, every issue was on the table, was a very constructive way to kickstart a very important relationship.
Now, Josh, as I'm sure you're aware, there is speculation in the media that the turn back the boats policy, while it may be retained in words, that it won't actually now be implemented in practice. What's your comment on that speculation?
I think we'll absolutely stick to our policies before the last election, which included turning back the boats when it was safe to do so. As Tony Abbott said from Jakarta, this is a no surprises policy with the Indonesians. We're not talking about breaching Indonesians' territorial sovereignty in any way. These will be operational decisions made at that moment. Look, I think the Indonesians fully understand how important it is for Australia to have an effective border protection system. What we've seen over the last 5.5 years is an unravelling of the effective policies of John Howard and his government, and the outcome has been tragedies like the hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have lost their lives at sea, together with 50,000 unauthorised boat arrivals. That's just not sustainable, Chris, and something needed to be done, and I think we're about to do it now.
But isn't that no surprises policy, isn't that in essence something of a watering down of the policies adopted by the Howard government? Because as I understood it, under the Howard government, on those few occasions when boats were turned back, they were turned back, and then Alexander Downer or a member of his department would then ring the Indonesians and tell them what had happened. You're saying now no surprises, so surely the Indonesians will be alerted before boats are turned back?
No, I'm just saying that we will allow the operational level commanders to make those calls at the moment, at that particular time, that the turning back the boats policy when it is safe to do so does not breach Indonesia's territorial sovereignty, and that it worked in the past and it will work again. But we will work very closely with Indonesia to ensure that they don't misunderstand our policy, and that our policy is an effective policy, because, as I said at the start, it's in both countries' interests to move away from the status quo and to get a more effective border protection policy in place.
But surely there would be an expectation now from the Indonesians that if there were a decision to turn back a boat, that they would be forewarned.
Well, I think what you're going to get is a much closer consultation, and I'm not privy to those consultations. I'm sure they're not going to share it with you and I, Chris. But the Indonesians and the Australian authorities and ministers will work very closely together.
Okay, turning to another issue, a domestic issue, the Senate, the final results are coming out this week. The government must be fairly happy with the makeup of the final Senate.
Look, I think the Senate system has been turned on its head effectively by the rise of these micro parties. And I know, for example, my own experience in Victoria was that a good friend and colleague, Helen Kroger, looks to have lost her spot, Chris, to a member of the Motor Enthusiast Party who just got a few thousand votes. I'm not sure this is what the voters intended. This is not what our founders intended when they put in place the Senate as the state's house, to see the rise of these micro parties with just a few thousand votes. But that's democracy. They're the rules. They've been elected. They're going to be elected. And as a government, we need to deal with responsible parties in the Senate, because it's all well and good to get your legislation through the House, but it doesn't come into law until it's gone through both houses. So I'm sure Tony Abbott and his team in the Senate will work very effectively together with the representatives from these new parties to ensure we can get our legislation through.
There has been some talk about reforming the electoral system for the Senate, optional preferential voting, or a minimum number of primary votes, for example. Is the government in favour of electoral reform for the Senate?
Well, I think this is a serious issue that needs some serious heads to look at, and it needs bipartisan support. I think it's going to be subject to some sort of parliamentary committee work. But we do need to take a good look at this issue, and it will require both sides, both major parties, Labor and Coalition, to come together to try to work out some effective alternatives. I'm sure that will be done during the life of this Parliament. There's a lot of water to run under the bridge before you get actually changes to legislation.
Now, Josh, as you say, the election of some of these micro parties to the Senate have taken us all by surprise, I guess, to an extent. But moving on from the election, we've had a couple of weeks now. What's the feeling in the government? Are these people that you've been able to sound out that you think the government will be able to work with to get legislation through? What's the feeling there?
I don't think you can generalise, Chris. I'm sure each of the different representatives to the Senate will have their own ideas, their own policy priorities, and certainly their own views about coalition election commitments. So that will be worked through individually, I'm sure. And there's always a bit of give and take. We saw that when John Howard's government was very successful in getting things through the Senate in negotiating with minor parties, in particular the Democrats there. The Labor-Green alliance, though, has been dreadful for the country, and any alternative to that is probably going to be much better for everyone.
Okay, if we move on, finally, the Labor Party, there was widespread expectation that post-election Labor would be tearing itself apart with recriminations, and instead we've seen this kind of loving between Bill Shorten and Anthony Albanese on one hand, and the sort of the canonisation of Julia Gillard on the other hand. Is this a concern to the government that Labor seems to have getting its act together more than most of us might have expected?
I don't think they've got their act together. They've just had a thumping defeat in the election. Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, wouldn't sit on the tram together, let alone have a meal together, let alone sit in the party room together. I mean, there's deep enmity there between their opposing camps, and I'm sure all that's going to come to the fore in the books that are being written now, whether it's by Rudd confidant Bruce Hawker or Julia Gillard herself or Kevin Rudd himself. I think these enmities will now play out in print. As for Anthony Albanese and Bill Shorten, they're fighting over the leadership of the Labor Party. But I did watch a bit of Q&A the other day when they were being debated, Chris, and the lady put her hand up, I think, and said, how, with you guys refusing to criticise each other and put forward original policies, how can we vote for either of you or think that any of you are actually the future of the Labor Party? And that's the problem. Both of them had their hands on the till when Labor was a disastrous government for the last 5.5 years. Both of them are responsible for the $300 billion of debt, the 50,000 unauthorised boat arrivals, the carbon tax and the mining tax, and both will be very ineffective, I think, should either of them get the call to be the leader. So we're very confident that we've got their measure, but more importantly, that we can get on with governing the country and chart a very different course for the nation than what we've seen over the last 5.5 disastrous Labor years.
Okay, Josh Frydenberg, thank you once again for joining us.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to be with you.